Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have a couple of tidbits, and I'll be showing you all 100 years of sweaters that I have knit for my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade. So let's get started. This tidbit came to me from James on Ravelry, and he sent me a message that said, "Hi Roxanne, I remember you mentioning in one of your old videos pre-COVID something about Charles I knitted silk waistcoat, and I think it going on display. I have a sneaking suspicion that COVID put paid to it going on display. Whilst looking for something else on the Museum of London website, I saw that they are opening an exhibition called Executions at the Museum of London Docklands in October, and this waistcoat is going to be on display. I thought this might be a good tidbit." And then he said that he's planning on visiting the exhibition purely to see the waistcoat, as he's fascinated to see it up close. So just to give those of you here in the United States some context for who Charles I was and what was going on that led up to his execution. Here in what would become the United States, we had a period of migration between 1620 and 1640 that was called the Great Migration. So this is when the Pilgrims came on the Mayflower, this is when the Puritans came, the Winthrop fleet came, and when Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded, including the city of Boston. So there was this huge amount of migration that was occurring during this time period, and it abruptly came to a halt in about 1640. And that is because Charles I was king in England, and he had some things that he was doing that the people were not too happy about, including his taxation, his views on religion, that sort of thing. And so the English Civil War began. That is what stopped migration, and in fact, some of the people, the colonists, returned to England, including about a third of the clergy that was in the colonies at the time. So migration really came to a near standstill. English migration wouldn't swell up again until after the Napoleonic Wars. So the English Civil War progressed through the 1640s, and I am not an expert on English history at all, but this is my understanding. And then it culminated in 1649 with the execution of Charles I, which actually ended the monarchy for a period of time. There's a very specific garment that Charles I wanted to wear underneath his clothes as he went to be executed. And that was a silk waistcoat or undershirt that was knit at a very fine gauge and would have added an extra layer of warmth. It was a cold day on the day he was going to be executed, and he didn't want to be seen shivering and have that interpreted as being shaking in fear. So that shirt is what is going to be on exhibit at this exhibition at the London Museum. The execution exhibition, the exhibition starts on the 14th of October and it continues through the 16th of April 2023. So the exhibition includes far more than just this one item of knitted clothing and this one execution, but it is likely the thing that is going to be most interesting to knitters. So I'll leave a link down in the show notes so you can read more about the exhibition. And from the museum's website, you can also book tickets if you are going to be in the London area sometime in the next 6 months or so. I'm also going to leave a link down below to a Wikipedia article on Charles I, just in case, like me, you don't know much about British history but are interested in learning more. I think this next tidbit may have just shown up in my Twitter feed because I cannot find any clue in my notes or messages that someone sent this to me. But if it did come from one of you, I really am trying to keep better track. What I need to do is actually make a note that this is something I found myself because I can never remember. But this tidbit is another museum exhibition, again in London, but this time at the Fashion Textile Museum. The exhibition is called Kaffe, Fassett, The Power of Pattern. So those of you who have been knitting for decades, like I have, will probably remember Kaffe Fassett's books from the 1980s. Back around 2010, I think it was, I found some Regia self-striping sock yarn that I absolutely loved, and it turned out that the colorway was designed by Kaffe. So then from that point on, I regularly tracked down any sock yarn colorway I could find that he had designed for Regia. In more recent years, he's been turning to fabric and quilt design. So he originally was a painter, and then he just transferred those skills he has of using color and with textile design in ways that are just absolutely wonderful. So the exhibition actually starts today, September 23rd, and it continues through the 12th of March, 2023. And again, I will leave a link below to the museum website so that you can learn more about the exhibition and book tickets if that's something of interest to you. Right now, I'm going to go to the overhead for a minute and show you the books that were my first exposure to Kaffe Fassett and his use of color. I first was introduced to him when I was a brand new knitter, when I was first learned to knit when I was living in Ireland in 1986. And I saw this book at the bookstore, which was called Glorious Knits. This was published in 1985. He had this amazing and has this amazing ability to use color and blend colors. He would use yarns, he would blend them together, and he worked with Rowan Yarns in the mid-80s to develop this entire sort of palette of yarns that could be used in his designs. He was really inspiring. I always aspired to knit something of his, and I actually did knit a vest. When I came back to the US, I had my roommates bought me enough yarn. They were all in art school, and they bought me enough yarn to knit myself a vest. And if I can find it, I think if it still exists in this house, I think I know where it is. And I will see if I can track it down in the next few weeks. But just the way he used color was just so amazing. These are all, of course, very oversized 1980s styles. But I always loved his use of color. And eventually he moved on to fabric and designing quilting fabrics and designing quilts. And that's kind of the area of textiles that he is in now. But this is where I first sort of became acquainted with Kaffe Fassett and his amazing use of color in knitted fabrics. So I have this one, and then in the late 80s, he came out with this one. And so it had stuff for kids as well, kids and adults in here. So some of you who were knitters back in the 1980s, this may be a trip down memory lane. I first began my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s back in December of 2018. I didn't set out at that time with a plan to knit 100 years worth of sweaters. I was just sitting at my desk wondering what sorts of knitting patterns might have been published in the newspaper 100 or 150 years ago, and then turning to digitized newspapers to see if I could find out, not knowing what I would find or what I would do with the answer that I got. 4 days later, I was casting on for an Edwardian era ladies sweater that I had no intention of finishing, never mind wearing. But it was during the course of knitting that first sweater, trying to get the answers to some questions that I had when I read that pattern, and then reading tons of other knitting patterns from the decades before and after that initial pattern was published, that I realized I knew very little about what knitting and knitting patterns were really like 100 or so years ago. What I did know, or thought I knew, turned out to be mostly wrong. So it was clear that I had a lot to learn, and I thought it would be both fun and a great learning opportunity to knit a sweater from each decade in order to really understand the evolution of the hand knit sweater and the hand knit sweater pattern. So I was interested in several aspects of sweater evolution, from the methods of construction that were used and the materials that were used to knit those sweaters, the techniques or the version of techniques that were used in different time periods, as well as how the patterns were presented to the knitter. I chose the particular sweater pattern for a given decade based on a couple of different criteria, but the main one was that there had to be something different about it that was new to me and that I could learn from. So some of you have been with me on this journey since the very beginning, back in the end of 2018, but most of you will have found my podcast along the way at some point. And so you may have missed seeing some of those sweaters the first time around, or maybe you saw them but you forgot about them. So what I'm going to do right now is put each sweater on my dress form and then talk about what it was that was interesting to me about each of these sweaters. So if you want to jump to a particular decade rather than sitting through all of them, or you want to jump back and forth, you can use the chapter links at the bottom of the video playback area of your screen in order to do that. So for each sweater, I will leave information down in the show notes about the pattern, as well as include a link to the project page in my Ravelry notebook. So you'll be able to see more photos of me in the sweater or on my dress form. You'll be able to get more notes, see what the name of the pattern is, what yarns I use, that sort of thing. So some of these patterns are in the public domain and can be found for free online. Others can be found used from online sellers, like in hard copy form. They are still under copyright and therefore not digitized. There's only going to be one that is going to be extremely difficult to track down, if not impossible, and that is the 1960s sweater. That came from a single pattern leaflet that was included in a kit. Those types of patterns in leaflet form don't have a very good survival rate because they're so easy to toss away, a lot easier than an entire book or booklet. So let's get started, and I'll take you on this journey from the 1890s to the 1980s. So this was originally a sweater for a boy. It was written to use a thinner yarn, probably something equivalent to a sport weight. In order to size it up for an adult, I used worsted weight, and the way that stitch proportions work, that should work pretty well. This pattern came with no information about gauge, no information about finished measurements, but it did say to work things for specific numbers of rounds. So that's not terribly helpful. But this, in many ways, was very emblematic of a sweater from the 1890s, except that it had a really weird construction. The way that this was constructed was bottom up in the round, all the way to the underarms. And then there was no underarm bind up, no underarm shaping, nothing like that. Separated front and back. So those were each knitted separately up to the shoulders. At which point it was rejoined in the round. And then there were these decreases only along the shoulder here. So kind of like a yoke in order to do the shoulder shaping. But when you already have the fabric up to here and you're doing the shaping, you're creating extra fabric right here. And the decrease rate was so slow that it would have resulted in, being about up to my eyeballs at this angle before the neck started. So I had to rip this back a few times in order to do that. And then this neck was quite loose, and that extra fabric length in the yoke actually worked out okay because it pushes up the neck right here, and then it allows this neck to kind of hang like a cowl neck. What was really weird were the sleeves. So again, this is a drop shoulder sweater. They had me pick up just a few inches at the top. And then as I was knitting back and forth, I would pick up one extra stitch. So it's like doing short rows without picking up all of the stitches first. And so it was creating this little kind of sleeve cap right here, which is not something you usually have in a drop shoulder sweater. And I'm not really clear why this was going on. You don't see this construction anywhere else. That's why I did it. It was very weird. And it fits way better than I expected, but it is still a weird sweater. This is the sweater that started the entire project. I saw a photo in an old digitized newspaper for this sweater, but it was a line drawing, and I was like amazed at the silhouette. This is the Edwardian era. It was the early 1900s. So you have that big poofy fronted. They would have been wearing corsets with a lot of padding to create a mono bosom. The way that this sweater was constructed was very similar to the way sweaters were constructed for women at the time. And these were athletic garments. This was not something you'd wear over to somebody's house or go to a cafe. And this is meant to be worn while playing golf or something like that. Started at the bottom of the back, went up to the shoulders. What's really interesting is that the seam line comes along the side of the back. It's not centered at the underarm. So it comes up the back. You bind off for the back, and then you knit the shoulders for like 1.5 inches. You're really basically creating a rectangular shape. That's for the neck. That's really common in this era. And then as many stitches as the entire back had is how many stitches you would cast on for each of those fronts. So it really doubled the amount of fabric, but this fabric has kind of this accordion pleating to it, which was really amazing. I'd never seen anything like that. And then when you get to the underarm, you cast on like about 4 inches worth of stitches here. So that's where you get all of the underarm depth that you need. You don't do half and half from the front and the back. Then you create what they call the pouch, which is all of that extra blousing that's vertical. And they do that with short rows. And so back and forth with short rows to create extra length in the front without increasing length in the back. And then right before doing the ribbing, huge decreases, like knit 3 together, knit 4 together, knit 3, like huge, massive decreases. And then the instructions for closing the front were face the front with a ribbon and then sew on the button and buttonholes. And there had been no mention of buttonholes previously. And before I saw what this fabric could do, I had no idea what was supposed to happen, because this is a very close-fitting neck and it's meant to be a very close-fitting waist. And what was supposed to happen to all that fabric? Was it supposed to overlap? And if it overlapped, how would you create this neck and waist closure? It didn't make any sense until I saw it on the dress form, and I realized that the way that this accordion fabric worked was that the back side of each of these fronts, they were actually facing each other. And so I could put ribbon on each of those faces inside here. So a button on here, put a buttonhole in here, and the buttons between the buttonhole and the fabric, so it doesn't poke through on the outside. So it's just sort of hidden in these pleats down the front. So I thought that this is the project that made me realize how different things were from what I expected from antique knitting patterns and sweaters and all kinds of things. And I thought there was a lot to learn from knitting a sweater from each decade and seeing how knitted sweater patterns evolved in terms of the kinds of yarns that were being used, how the patterns were presented, what the purpose of a sweater was, and then how the pattern was presented to the actual knitter. All of those things changed over the course of 100 years, and I wanted to see when those changes happened, what those changes were, and if I could figure out what was influencing those changes. This is my World War I sweater. So this is where I started seeing some things differ in terms of construction that showed a little bit more tailoring. So the 1890s and the 1900s, there was no shoulder shaping at all. Oftentimes, like for a pullover, the front and back would have been knit exactly the same. So for this sweater, instead of working from the back up to the shoulders and then down, which was very common, this was actually worked separately in pieces. The fronts and the back were worked separately from each other. And the back at the shoulders had shoulder shaping. So it wasn't just straight across, it was angled here. And the shoulder shaping used short rows. So that was really interesting to me to start seeing that there was the use of short row shaping. Like all of the sweaters so far, the sleeves were knit top down. Some sweaters will have you pick up stitches and work top down, like my 1890 sweater. My 1900 sweater, it was cast on at the top and then work your way down. This one was also cast on at the top. And then again, the sleeve cap was shaped with shoulder shaping, and they called for a different type of short row turn than they had called for in the shoulder, and that was really interesting. This has pockets. Again, this is an athletic garment. The model is posed holding a riding crop, this sweater had pockets. So this is exactly the type of sweater that I really like. I wear this a lot. The one thing that was a little challenging for me was that the instructions, there was a big chunk of instructions missing. So there was instructions as you were transitioning to the cuff to reduce the number of stitches and then change to a different needle, and then there was nothing. There was no instruction until the very last instruction for creating the shawl collar. So there's all of the cuff instructions and all of the instructions for how to actually knit the shawl collar were missing. And so I had to sort of reverse engineer the instructions for the shawl collar based on that last line. And I ended up with something that was quite a bit wider than intended, but I actually like this. Once I tried it on and I realized, oh, what I did wasn't what was in the pattern photo. I didn't want to rip it out and change it because I really like this extra height that I get here. I can't see. Okay, so there's all of this extra height. It's probably twice as tall as the original pattern had it. This is a stitch pattern that a lot of times we call mistake rib. So it's just, I just love this sweater. It's so practical. And the name of the pattern was called Serviceable Sweater. Now, so far, every pattern that I've knit is in the public domain, and I was able to find it online. I will put links down below to the sources that I used for these various patterns. There are different sources for each of them. All right, so this is my 1920s sweater. This is a crazy sweater. I was pretty sure I was never going to wear this, but there are so many intriguing things about the construction of it. So this is one that was very common in these early eras, where it starts at the bottom of the back and it goes up to the shoulders. But in this case, this very horizontal pattern here, once you get to the underarms, you cast on for the entire length of the sleeves, and then you come up to the shoulders and then you reverse everything. The challenge with something like this is when you have these horizontal bands that have very specific numbers of rows, and you want to keep this horizontal pattern here, there are specific places where you need to separate or where you need to complete things. And so I needed to be able to complete the pattern up to the middle of the shoulder and then reverse it so everything would be identical on the way down. And the trouble with this, because they needed a very specific number of rows, they gave no finished length measurements, no row gauge information. And this, like all of the patterns so far, came in one size, and it would be up to the knitter to make modifications. Well, this is maybe something that you can design fairly easily for one size, knowing your specific gauge, stitch gauge and row gauge. But if anything is different, the size you need, or if your row gauge is different, or anything like that, it really complicates making a modification. And that was the problem that I had with this. I ended up having to need to add an extra horizontal band just to get the length I needed. And then it was going to be kind of too short in the depth for the underarm. And so I ended up creating some gussets. But one of the reasons I really was taken with this sweater was because of the sleeves at the bottom. They had these kind of slashes in them. I'd never seen anything like that, so that when it's worn, it creates this kind of puffiness. And then one of the other challenges was that the cuffs and these little squares around the neck were crocheted, and I have very rudimentary crochet skills, so I really had to learn quite a bit in order to get a good result in these squares with these lines and not have it look toothy. So I learned a huge amount from this sweater. It was probably the most complicated one, and I think the one thing that I would do differently now that I've seen the result is that I would have brought the neckline down to the base of the blue, because if you compare to the original photo, you can see that proportionally the neck is quite a bit lower. I had to add length because my row gauge was different, but I kept the actual number of rows the same for the neck. So that's something I would have done differently looking back on it, but otherwise, I'm very happy with what it was that I learned. Again, this was a free pattern. I found the booklet for this pattern on yet another website, Antique Pattern Library. So again, I'll put the links down in the description so you can see all of these different sweaters. So this was the 1920s. Okay, this is my 1930s sweater, and what is typical about the sweater for the era is that it is a close-fitting sweater, and it fits right at the natural waist. We've entered an era where people would actually be working this and wearing these as a fashion item, and maybe wearing it to work with a skirt. It was not an athletic garment. And another thing that was kind of typical or not uncommon for the era was this yoke. What's different about yoke construction in the 30s and even into the 40s is that the bodice is shaped. So the bodice comes all the way up. You can see that the fabric comes all the way up to the shoulder, and the yoke fits into that shaped bodice, and there are set-in sleeves. You don't have this kind of yoke that comes across the shoulders or even down to the underarms. That is not what they were doing back then. And what I really loved about this sweater pattern was the way that bodice construction was done. It was done using short rows. So as you were working toward the neck, rather than doing like a decrease, you just worked one stitch less than you did before, and you went back to the armhole, came back one stitch less, one stitch less. So then you ended up with all of these stitches on the needle at this diagonal. Now that wouldn't be enough stitches along that diagonal to actually work something. You had to double the number of stitches, and so they had a very clever way of doing that. So you could keep all of the live stitches on each of these separate pieces until it was time to actually work the yoke, and then you'd work the yoke back and forth in one piece. So this was a pretty common way of doing a yoke construction in the 1930s, and because I love a set-in sleeve, I really loved it a lot. And another thing that was interesting about the sleeve is the way it was shaped, because it's very close fitting. There's this kind of weird increase thing that comes along near the underarm, and it's basically a knit-in gusset to give more room at the underarm while giving a very close fit. So those are a couple of really interesting construction pieces that I hadn't seen before, and really made me want to knit this sweater. So this is my 1940s sweater, and this is very typical of the era in terms of it's knit with fingering weight yarn. Again, has a close fit. It has 3/4 length sleeves, and it has a very close fitting neck, the same as the 1930s cardigan. Because of these close fitting necks that often didn't have ribbing in them, sometimes they did, but a lot of times they didn't. There were a couple of ways that the opening was made large enough to fit over the actual head. One was to make it a cardigan, like my 1930s sweater. Another was to create an opening somewhere along the neckline that would allow it to be pulled over. So if for something, it might not be a cardigan, it might just be like a little keyhole with a button closure or something here. This sweater has got snaps on the shoulder. Sometimes they would have a button or a snap or a very short zipper up the back of the neck in order to create this short neck. Now this sweater originally did not have any kind of scooped neck. It has this very horizontal triangular design, and there was supposed to be one more triangle up here, and that would create this very horizontal front and back. They would have been identical, and I knew that the fit for that, I wouldn't like the fit. But part of that design was then that the neck was hemmed just like there was a hem at the base of the body and also at the base of the sleeves. And I wanted to maintain that look in the sweater. I wanted that hem sweater. The only way I could do that was if I kept the stitches live around the entire neck instead of binding off and then trying to pick up. And so I used the technique that I learned in the 1930s sweater of using short rows to do the shaping up here. I did that for the neck, so I could eliminate the top triangle and shape the neck and create a hem that could be folded under. And I really ended up being very happy with both the fit of this and the ingenuity of the 1930s sweater that allowed me to use that and solve that problem for the 1940s. All of these sweaters, again, are still only in one size. So any modifications, I usually didn't have to make a lot in terms of size modifications. Some decades I didn't have to make any, and others I had to do a little bit. This one I had to do a little bit. The other thing that I really liked about the sweater was that it had, not only did it have waist shaping at the side, it's got these waist darts right here. So there were multiple points in the round where the waist was going in. And I'd heard of that before, but I had never done it before. I'd never actually knit it in a sweater. And so those are the things that, that I really wanted to try for this particular sweater. Okay, this is my 1950s sweater. This is really a jacket. It's a raglan jacket, and again, it has 3/4 length sleeves. It was so common back in the 1950s. This one has raglan sleeves, and what I really liked about it was the design along the seam line. So this was knit bottom up flat in pieces, and they were seamed. And normally I would use mattress stitch to do seaming. They weren't advising mattress stitch in knitting at this point yet, but they did have a very specific flat seam that they were recommending. And so I did some swatching and I tried it. I loved it for this raglan here with the garter stitch triangles. The other thing that was really interesting to me was that there was this diagonal pocket as well. I hadn't done a diagonal pocket. I really liked the way the triangles. This is a very simple sweater to knit. It was knit with what would be considered a heavy worsted yarn. So this was a pretty quick sweater to knit. It only really took me a few weeks, I believe. It was knit with what would be considered a heavy worsted yarn. I think it was 4.5 stitches per inch, 18 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And kind of on the shorter side is the jacket, but it's not as short as some of the other sweaters that I knit in the mid-century. So I really like this. I also really lucked out with the buttons on this. I found buttons that had triangles that kind of repeated the triangle garter stitch shape. This is the first pattern that I knit that came in multiple sizes. So after World War II, that's when you start seeing patterns presented in more than one size. All right, this is my 1960s sweater. In some ways, this is one that I was the most excited to knit, and also the one that I thought would be the least fun, the least amount of fun to knit, and I was kind of right. It's, you know, it's plain, solid color stockinette, and with knit 1 purl 1 ribbing, and this collar up here is knit 1 purl 1 ribbing. What was exciting to me about this is that this was a yarn that came in a kit. So it came with enough yarn to make the sweater, and the pattern was missing from this kit. And it came with a skirt length of hand-woven wool fabric from the Scottish border counties. So that was really fantastic to me, that I could knit from some vintage yarn, because I'd had to source my own yarn, try to figure out what yarn would be appropriate in all of these previous sweaters. And this is the first time I could use yarn that was actually from the era. I was very taken with the pattern I got from another kit. So when I discovered that kits were something that were very common in the 60s, I went over to eBay and I bought up 3 different kits. And one of them had all of the yarn. It had 2 patterns in it. It had the fabric for a skirt, it had buttons, and it had grosgrain ribbon. I didn't, however, like the colors, but I just liked the fact that I had the kit. It had this pattern in it. I really liked this color. I didn't know what the name for this type of collar would be, and somebody suggested it would be called a sailor collar. So if you look at the front, this is like if you were wearing a sailor type shirt. On the back you might have that kind of rectangular flap coming down, but this is what the front would look like. So it's kind of this V-neck that goes all the way to the shoulder, and then the ribbing is actually just straight up. It is shaped along the edge. This had to be sewn together. But otherwise, just the fact that it's ribbing that's going to contract and it was knit at a smaller gauge causes that neckline to open. So I really loved the idea of this. I loved the fact that I had the yarn and the pattern from these kits. And the place where I buy my buttons, I had vintage 1960s buttons. I mean, I just loved all of that. But it was fingering weight yarn in a solid color. It was very boring to knit. There's a lot of stitches in it. And I ended up having to knit the sleeves twice because my gauge got off when I was knitting the sleeves, and they ended up being too big and didn't fit correctly into the holes. And so I took quite a few timeouts from this particular sweater. I think this one took me, in terms of passage of time, more than a year from the time I started to the time it was finally completed. This is, of course, is my 1970s sweater that I completed a couple of weeks ago. By this point in the 20th century, patterns were really written in a number by number, like here are the numbers. There would be a lot of different sizes, but there was very little information for knitters if they wanted to modify or design their own. But in the early 70s, that's when Elizabeth Zimmerman published Knitting Without Tears, when Barbara Walker was publishing her stitch dictionaries, her treasuries of knitting patterns, and when Barbara Walker also wrote Knitting from the Top. And so they were giving knitters the tools for how do you knit a sweater that has what you like and that's going to fit you. Here's the process. It's not a numbers and do this, do this, do this type of thing. It's here's how you think this through, and here's the process that you can use. So this is a seamless set-in sleeve sweater, according to Elizabeth Zimmerman's using her percentage system and the method that she explained in what's called the kangaroo pouch sweater. So it's knit bottom up for the body in the round up to the armholes. And then you put on as many stitches as are necessary to narrow the body enough so that the sleeves or the stitches that are remaining on the needles are going to line up with the shoulders. So you have a bunch of stitches on hold. You've got your front and your back, and then you work across the front. You cast on a few bridge stitches, work across the back, cast on a few bridge stitches, and then you can continue working in the round all the way up to the shoulders. You can do the same thing where you're putting stitches on hold if you want to, like I wanted a neckline, so I put stitches on hold again, cast on a few bridge stitches, and then worked in the round. So the entire body is worked in the round up to the shoulders. And then you use steeks. You cut those you secure the bridge stitches, and then you cut up the middle in order to open up the fabric. And then there is a method of picking up stitches in order to work the set-in sleeve using a combination of short rows and decreases in order to bring the stitch count down to what you need for the actual bicep of your arm, and then you work down to do your shaping. So this was a lot of fun to knit. It only took me probably 3 weeks or so to knit this. I really like it a lot, and I use stitch patterns from Barbara Walker's Second Treasury. I really like the fact that one panel has a background of pearls and it has stockinette and moss stitch, and then the other panel will have a background of stockinette with a moss stitch pattern. So you get this kind of brocade look in the texture, and I really loved that. So there are quite a few things that I learned from this sweater that I will probably use in future sweaters with some modification. I'm not going to steek something that's knit and worked in a knit purl pattern. There's no point, I don't think, for that, but I wanted to try it. So that's my 1970s sweater. This is the 1980s sweater that I was showing you guys last week. This is a sweater that I actually knit in the late 80s, like 1989, 1990. It really typifies what was going on in that time, which was oversized sweaters with these overall intarsia designs. This is a pattern from Sasha Kagan. Again, it has pockets. I love a cardigan, and I love a cardigan with pockets, and I love a shawl collar. Again, it sort of typifies the era in terms of the shaping and the color. And this is something that was in a book that I had, but I came across in a full kit. So it had all the yarns that were called for, because there were quite a few colors, and that would have been a challenge for me to find colors that would have worked together and that I would have liked as much as I liked the original colorway. So that was the long-term project in a nutshell. I am just getting started on figuring out what my 1990s sweater will be. My intent at the moment is to knit a Fair Isle sweater of some sort based on the many books published in the 1980s and 90s on traditional knitting. I have a ton of those types of books in my library. A lot of them are right up here, but some of them are in another part of my knitting library. So in the coming weeks, as I get a better handle on exactly what I'm going to be doing, I'll give you a tour of these types of books and show you what resources I'm going to be using in order to design that sweater. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, you can leave those down in the comments below. Also, if you have any questions about YouTube and how it all works, I'll be doing a video answering your questions about me, my channel, and YouTube. Anything you want to know when my silver play button arrives, which acknowledges achieving 100,000 subscribers. Whether it's a question about how channels are monetized or what the process is for making a YouTube video, please ask anything you'd like down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.